Captain Peter Cutsie, South Korea, and this is my briefing room. We're in Muscat, Oman. We're downwind. We're runway 08 left. That is for an RNAV approach to runway 08 left, labeled as RNP. This is part of this particular PowerPoint presentation that I'm making. We have it on the left-hand side of the screen. We've been through the requirements already in video number 1, and this is what we're referring to here. This is our position in a real-time map on the north side, and we are level at 3,400 feet. We're in the simulator now, and we're using HUD, the PFD, and the nav display. That's our position downwind. We have a 15-knot crosswind from 355 degrees at 15 knots, which is a 90-degree crosswind. That's reflected on the HUD, as we can see. We're downwind. The wind is from the right at 90 degrees, and our flight path symbol and Q are displaced to the left of the center on the HUD. We'll go to the progress page and have a look at a few items. We will go dynamic again. And now we'll freeze the simulator so we can better explain what we're looking at. We are left of the selected course. There's a selected course. We are left 7.85 nautical miles. Well, if you look at the scale, there's a 10-mile arc, 5-mile arc, so 7.85 is correct. Vertical deviation, there is no vertical deviation. As you can see, the selected cruise altitude is 3,400 feet, and we are at 3,400 feet. Therefore, there is no deviation. If we were at, say, 4,400 feet, and the cruise altitude was set at 34, the deviation would be vertically at 1,000 feet. So that's something that we were talking about in the PowerPoint, and I wanted to bring that point to your attention. What we'll do shortly is we'll configure for flaps 5, because I'm by myself on the flight deck, and then turn to left base. Generally, you would configure to flaps 5 when on base leg. So we'll go into the simulator and view just what I've been speaking about. All right, yeah, here we are in the sim, and we are going to turn left base as we go by ITLAC, and we've extended the center line of the approach track from ITLAC. And ITLAC at 3,400, we are currently at 3,400, so that's looking good. All right, we have been given a vector, and we are turning to a heading assigned here of 170 degrees. We've configured to flaps 5 speed set. The descent procedure, approach procedures, and applicable checklists have been complete. Remember, this is an RNP approach to runway 08 left. The minimum set at 325 for a Class C type aircraft. We are FMC speed, heading cell, and VNAV path. ILSs have been detuned. You can see our position here. We're just coming into the extended center line from ETLAC. Back in the sim, and I'll unfreeze the simulator here now so that we can have a look at the indications on the primary flight display and the nav display. Let's freeze the simulator here so I can point something out to you. If you notice here, the small delta, that is actually the center line of our track in the RNAV process, RNP AMP. And this is the vertical path here. Remember, there's no ILS tuned. These are part of the nav performance scale. And we are in VNAV path, and we will have a look at a vertical path later. And if you notice, on the HUD, the flight path symbol and the associated Q are off to the right of the center because we've now turned virtually through 180 degrees. The wind is from our left at 355 at 15 knots. So for HUD users, and in many of my HUD videos, you would understand that. Let's go over to the indications that we have for the nav for this RNP AMP. If you look at the bottom of the nav display, the RNP is 1.0 and the actual nav performance is 0.02. And if you can remember from the PowerPoint, the RNP changes depending on whether you are overseas, whether you're en route, whether you're in the terminal area, or whether you're on approach. And the AMP is the actual performance. So we're well within the scope of actual performance. We'll be monitoring this symbol here and this symbol here. Remember, that's your glide path. And let's go back to the chart to see when we should actually start down as far as those nav performance scales are concerned. Now, if you look over here, ITLAC at 3,400, and here we are here coming up to ITLAC, and the final descent is at from 2,200 feet at Mike 07 Whiskey Lima, Mike 07 Whiskey Lima, at which time we'll be intercepting a 3.10 degree glide slope. So that's where we're going to be looking at the actual NPS vertical, as far as the vertical displacement is concerned. So I'll point that out as we go along. Somewhere in this whole process, because we're in VNAV path, we have to make sure that the vertical altitude on the MCP is lowered. The minimum at the field for this particular approach was 325. We rounded it up to 400 feet. And if you notice, that's what we've got set for VNAV path. Now, as we come up to the top of descent, which is very shortly, we will actually intercept the vertical path to 2,200 feet, because that's what's on the legs page. So we're going to follow this through, and we'll point out the nav performance scales and what we are doing with respect to path. Remember, we have to be in VNAV path for this entire maneuver. And we'll go back to the legs page and we'll point out the importance of having the right altitudes and the glide path on the legs page. You notice on the profile, it's lack at 3,400 and 3,400 or above. So that's fine. We'll make that good, and that's what we're at. There were no temperature corrections. We have the correct altimeter setting. I say that because when you look at my cold weather ops and when the temperatures are much lower than ISA, corrections have to be made. Otherwise, everything will not work safely. and I've done several videos on temperature corrections, all in my library. Back to what we're talking about. So we're coming up to ITLAC at 3,400. The aircraft will start down to 2,200 so that we're at 2,200 by Mike 07 Whiskey Lima. And then from then, a 3.1 degree path. If you notice over here on the legs page, 3.1. So that's important. And if you notice Mike 07 Whiskey Lima at 2,200 on the chart, but 2,200 or above. So as long as we are not lower than 2,200 before Mike 07 Whiskey Lima, we're fine. And we haven't had to make any temperature corrections. Now, temperature at the field is 32 degrees Celsius. Standard for Muscat is 15 degrees Celsius. We're very close to that for 14.85, whatever. We don't make corrections when temperatures are warmer than standard. But what we have to realize is that we may be higher than we will be higher, definitely. And so, because we don't fly lower. So that's important to realize that when the temperature is away from standard on the cold side, we make corrections so that we're safe. But on the warm side, we do not make corrections, but we have to expect that we will be high when we go visual, when we decide to land. And how high? It's all based on the formula that's used for temperature corrections. All right, and I've talked about that in videos and actually pointed out what that formula is. We've gone back to the sim, and remember now this is a two-stage descent virtually from ITLAC 3,400 to Mike 07 Whiskey Lima at 2,200, but the final descent is Mike 07 Whiskey Lima at this particular airport. And we have drawn a 2 nautical mile ring around Mike 07 Whiskey Lima to remind us that when we get to 2 nautical miles prior, then we will configure gear down, flaps 15, speed brakes armed, and then configure to landing flap, in today's case, flap 30. And then once we've started down and we're 300 feet away from the missed approach altitude, we'll set the MCP altitude to the missed approach altitude, which is for this airport, it's at 6,000 feet. I've set the visual to a night scene so that we can better appreciate the approach lights and see how accurate an RNP, AMP, RNAV approach can actually be. Before we unlock the simulator to a dynamic mode, remember that the final descent, second stage final descent, is really where we would configure 2 nautical miles before that. So some carriers teach to draw a 2 nautical mile circle around the final descent point. And I think that's a great idea to trigger us at that point to the gear down, flaps 15, speed brakes armed, and then make sure we're in VNAV path, make sure the minimum has been set, and round it up in our case to 400 feet, and our RNP AMP check, and then configure the landing flap. And once we've done that, and we've started the final descent, and we're more than 300 feet below the missed approach altitude, which we will be, then we can set the missed approach altitude. In our case, the missed approach altitude today is 6,000 feet. So there are a number of items, approximately 8 items to be done at 2 nautical miles. That's why I think it's a good idea to have a trigger and we've put that trigger on the fixed page to remind us that that is really where we configure for the approach and landing. All right, here we are configured, and we're coming up to Mike 07 Whiskey Lima. I've frozen the simulator just to let you see, and we've configured for flaps 15, and we were in VNAV path, and we still are, and our MDA has been set. So all of those items, 8 items, have been completed, and we've selected landing flap, and we've selected VREF 30 plus 5, and the speed is decaying to that now, as you can see. So, and we've got a good rated descent, and we're not at Mike 07 Whiskey Lima, which is our final fix. We are just coming up on that. So this is the importance of monitoring the nav performance scales. And if we didn't have nav performance scales, we would actually go and have a look at the progress page. And let's pop over and have a look at that now. Cross track arrow 0. And vertical deviation 15 feet low. That's pretty good. So in other words, the nav performance scales that we're looking at on the other screen, we'll go back to that in a second, were accurate. And radio altimeter, of course, was alive, and that call didn't come because I'm busy on the flight deck, but remember, all the calls are very important. And the radio altimeter alive and for your position compared to the barometric altimeter, and providing the altimeter setting was correct, and providing there were no corrections required because of temperature, then your pilot thinking is, yes, acceptable. All those things I talk about in my library and are important, and they come under airmanship. We're dynamic, and we are going by our final fix, and we have started a rate of descent. You can see it here, and it's reasonable, which is good. And we have yet to do the landing checklist because we haven't set the missed approach altitude. And we'll actually do that now because we are in VNAV path, and that is set at 6,000 feet. Now we can do the landing checklist. Looking at our RNP, AMP against the RNP, we're within 60 feet. AMP and the RNP is 400, looking good. And the actual track, this little symbol here and this little symbol here shouldn't be there. That's just a simulator glitch. But this is the actual nav performance track, as we talked about, and this is the actual path that we were looking at, which is the 3.1 degree path. Rate of descent is good for our speed, so everything checks out okay. The barrel minimum is 325, so we would make all calls in accordance with our company SOPs. Each airline varies depending on their SOPs. So we're coming up to 1,000 feet. The radio altimeter looks good for temperature and altimeter setting, so that checks okay. And I've got the weather set at minimums, and when we are at minimum, I'll freeze the simulator. We'll have a look outside and say, wow, doesn't this RNAV, AR, RNP, AMP work well? We're starting to view the approach lights. Now we can see the approach lights. and the runway end identifier lights. So all the proper calls were made and a successful RMP approach. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next series. Remember, if you subscribe to my library, you'll be privy to everything you'll need to fly the 737 or the MAX on an initial course, ab initio course, conversion course, recurrent training, refresher training, you name it. That's what I do here in South Korea, and thank you for watching.